Good evening, everybody, and welcome to tonight's webinar. I think tonight is our 72nd webinar, so amazing really now that we're into that higher number. So let's make a start at this point, and we know that there's more people will be joining us, but we're going to be looking, as I said, at professional curiosity. Now, for me, in terms of my thinking around professional curiosity, you know, I've been a social worker qualified for 32 years. When I trained, it was a 4-year course. So it's, for me, 36 years since I got involved in social work, since I started my social work training. And they didn't used to use the phrase professional curiosity. It's actually a fairly new phrase. So for me, for someone who's been around for a long time, when I started to hear it, I was thinking, oh, what's this all about? And then when I've really looked at it, for me, this is something that should simply become a part of who you are. It just becomes a part of who you are as a person. So, for example, it sometimes brings me into a bit of a loving conflict, but a bit of conflict with my husband, because he'll say, have you finished work now? And I'll say, why? He'll say, what's for tea? I'll say, why? And he goes, well, I just want to know what's for me tea. But I always ask, when he's asking me something, I always go, why? And I'm conscious of it now. But I think I've done that more and more and more over the years. I think it's that bit about just always wanting to know. I think that bit about being incredibly curious and being interested is just a part of who you are. Asking why constantly, it's a part of who you are. To me, it's really about the skilled use of questions, asking questions, constantly questioning things, almost relentlessly questioning things, but not interrogating. People don't need to feel that they're being interrogated through that questioning, but you're constantly asking questions. You're constantly asking questions of yourself. It's that constant questioning stance. And that's why when last week, if you were at our session last week when we talked about placements, it's why I was really clear last week that there is no such thing as a silly question. Because as a student, if you start to think to yourself, oh, I won't ask that. I hear a phrase, oh, it's a stupid question. That's a horrible phrase to use, but, oh, it's a silly question. I won't ask that. That's problematic, because that is you stopping asking questions. That is you turning off your professional curiosity. You need to switch on and light up your professional curiosity. Don't dampen it, you know, and thinking, oh, I won't ask that question because it's a silly question, is dampening it. Ask the questions. As a practice educator, and I've said this to you last week, I want students to ask me questions because it shows me that they have a curiosity. If I said something, you know, if I'm delivering, I don't know, a training session, and at various points I'll say, does anybody have any questions? I desperately want people to ask me questions because it shows that they're skilled. If they don't ask me questions, if it's just like, you know, I've just taken that on face value, that really worries me. So ask questions. It's also about skilled listening, really properly listening to people, listening to understand what they're saying, rather than listening to respond. What do I need to say? I think there's a lot of that. Or even, I've just talked about the importance of questioning, and sometimes people listen to think, what question should I ask next? Don't do that. Don't listen to think, what am I going to do next? Listen to understand the person. Really demonstrate active, proper, careful listening. So for me, professional curiosity is really those couple of things. It's about skilled questioning and it's about skilled listening. So developing your skills in reflection and reflective practice, which is a lot of what we do in these webinars. When we first started the webinars, you know, all that time ago, and we just started them because of lockdown and because we thought people were, you know, becoming disconnected from learning and stuff. It was all about then theory and reflection. And that's stayed our commitment throughout, really, as our mission is about theory and reflection. So developing your skills in reflection and reflective practice, that is the first key step in developing professional curiosity. If you think about and remember the steps of reflection that we've looked at how you move up those steps and you become more reflexive with an X over time as you progress and develop and deepen your reflective skills. And it's that kind of top step of reflexivity that takes you into analysis and onto professional curiosity. So reflective practice is really important. And the other thing that this is about, for me, that it has a really close connection to, is professional humility. Recognizing that we don't know everything and we'll never know everything. And it's comfortable as long as you admit you don't know everything. It's not comfortable when you think that you know everything. So that professional humility and professional curiosity, to me, they're like really closely related, those two things. So they're my thoughts, and Yvonne's going to share with us like the depth and detail around professional curiosity, but that's my thoughts, having, you know, been around before the concept was talked about, if you like. They're my thoughts. But for me, this has been a constant companion to me through all of my years, those 36 years. I think I started to use this in my first placement. So in my second year at university, in my first placement, we did 5 placements in those days. I think that's when I started to use it. I wish I could remember where I originally had it from, but it's just something I've used for years. I've talked about it now for years. You're probably fed up of hearing it, but actually it's worth revisiting constantly. I revisit this constantly, and this is what keeps me professionally curious. Using the what, why, and how framework. When you're going out to see somebody, you ought to be looking at what's happening for this person. Why has this situation come about? How can I work with them to bring about change or improved outcomes? What, why, how? That's what we should be doing all of the time. My fear is when we're very busy, and we're always very busy, but when we're in crisis times, and you know, we're at the moment, there's still a global pandemic crisis. There's also a social care crisis. There's also a staffing crisis for social work. There's a massive number of crises that are hitting us as social workers at the moment. And when we're in that crisis stage, the danger is the why falls off, and it becomes what's happened, how am I going to deal with it, what's going on now, how am I going to respond to this? We lose the why. We lose professional curiosity. Why is professional curiosity? Asking why. Just practice asking why. Just do it all the time. You know, someone says, what's for your tea? Why? Because I just do that constantly, and I know it's probably really irritating to people, but just why? Why do you need to know that? Why? Just constantly asking why is a really good starting point for learning to be professionally curious. Don't lose the why. The why is where your theory comes in. It's where reflection comes in, and it is professional curiosity. So you could use this to think about, if you're on placement now, what's happening for this person? Why is it happening? How can I work with them to bring about change or improved outcomes? But even if you're not yet on placement, even if you're right at the start of your journey, or as you know, some of our team members, you know that Julianne is en route to going into social work training, but isn't there yet. So we're all at different stages of our career on the team together as well. So even if you're not at that point yet, you could use the what, why, how framework after every webinar. After every webinar, when we close it, just think to yourself, what am I thinking and feeling after this session tonight? You could think about what have I learned, but I really want, you know, you to get in touch with what am I thinking and feeling, and why do I feel that? Why? And how might that impact on the kind of social worker that I want to be? You could do that in 5 minutes after every webinar. What am I thinking and feeling? Why? How might that impact? Do you remember we did a session on death making? If you didn't end that session feeling angry and cross at society, then there's something I'd like to explore with you, because we should have all been cross about what was happening there. So explore your thoughts, your feelings, explore why and how that might impact on the kind of worker that you want to be. So the what, why, how framework is your basic starting point. You probably get fed up. Yvonne goes on about that all the time, but I go on about it all the time because it's so important, and yet it gets so easily lost. It's the why is the first thing that falls off your agenda when you're busy. And actually, it's probably the most important thing to keep on your agenda. So that's, I suppose, the starting point. that what, why, how can take you into lots of different places. And perhaps for me, one of the other things about professional curiosity is that it's about moving beyond storytelling. And there's a reason I'm telling you that now, that there's stories, but it goes beyond storytelling. If you think about it, when you read your bedtime story, or you read your own novel, not a textbook, but a storybook, if you're reading a book, there's a lot of what happened, who the characters are, where it happened, when it happened. There's a lot of that. There's very little why and how in a story. Why and how is your analysis. Why and how is the professional bit. So it's about taking it beyond stories and beyond storytelling. And sometimes I feel that social workers, when I'm asking them to share a reflection with me, sometimes I feel like they're sharing a story with me. They're not really reflecting, they're telling me the story. And it's not even their own story, it's the story of the service user. They need to reflect on that. They need to go beyond telling of the story. And there's two purposes, two reasons I've said that. And one thing that I wanted to share with you tonight is something that I saw earlier in the week, and you can see it now at the moment. It says there's a screenshot of it there. It's taken from iNews, an article called "Why the Care System is Removing More Children from Their Families and Yet Missing Some of the Most Vulnerable." It's written by Polly Curtis. It's very recent. You can see it was there. It was on the 3rd of February. And I read this. And I've got to say to you that the bit that I've highlighted there absolutely jumped out at me. So Isabel Trowler, who is the Chief Social Worker for England for Children and Families, and it doesn't point that out, but she's the Chief Social Worker for Children and Families in England. Apparently, this article says you have to decide what is really going on. You hear lots of stories about increased poverty, reductions in public spending, complexity. I'm really skeptical that it is only those things. Now, when I read that, I had a lot of feelings, but then I started to question it. I started to question, did Isabel Trowler really say that? Or is that a misinterpretation of what she actually said? Have they tried to précis it into, a very short statement, and maybe she said something much longer, and maybe this is therefore a bit of a misrepresentation of what she said? So that's something. But if she did say it, I'm interested. I'm interested on two things. I'm interested in why Isabel Trowler said you have to decide what's going on. Because before you decide, you've got to discover, you've got to be curious, you've got to try and find out. You don't just walk into a situation and decide what's going on. You have to find out what's going on. You don't decide what's going on. You find out what's going on, and then you decide, you make decisions about where you go from there. So that's one thing that I was interested in. But then the other thing I was interested in was, she said, you hear lots of stories about increased poverty, about reductions in public spending, about complexity. And I've got to say, they're not stories, that's real life. People are living in poverty. We are experiencing something in our society that we have never, ever experienced in our generation before. We are experiencing situations where people have to make a decision about whether to heat their home, whether to eat, I'm hearing, you're seeing it on the news all the time, bed poverty, fuel poverty. It's just poverty. It's just poverty. And we are surrounded by it as social workers. And that's not a story. So I might be being a bit political here, but if Isabel Trowler did say that, then my argument back to that is, this is not a story. This is real life. And we need to be clear about that real life. And apologies if you think that that is overly political for tonight, but there's a couple of aspects to it there, aren't there? Professional curiosity. Let's find out. And I suppose what I'd say to you is, if you remember, and the team's going to be really cross at me because we sometimes talk about what are you going to make links to, and then they can put it in the chat. And I forgot about this. It's just come off the top of my head now. It's because I'm being professionally curious. But the webinar that we did with Prospera Tedham, where she talked about the 4D2P model, actually fits this brilliantly. So if you've got Prospera's book, Anti-Oppressive Practice in Social Work, where she talks about the Ds being about discovering before deciding. That's key. Discover before you decide. Discuss, discover, decide, and then disrupt. And that fits perfectly, that little bit of highlighted stuff that I put there. You first, before you can decide, you've got to discuss with people. You've got to discover, then you can decide, and then you've got to disrupt that poverty. You've got to disrupt that political stance of it's not about poverty. It's not solely about poverty, but it is about poverty at the moment. And social work's got to start to, I think we've got to wake up to that and recognise the poverty that we're working with. So, it's not about storytelling, it's not about stories, but I'm going to share with you now a story. It's real life. It's something that I was involved with many, many years ago as a social worker. But I've anonymised it sufficiently so that it couldn't be recognised. But this is real. This is something that actually happened. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to share it with you. I'll read it out to you. And then we're going to ask you what you might do in this situation, and maybe have a think about it, maybe see how professionally curious you are. And then Yvonne's going to take over and she's going to talk through the session, and then we'll come back and we'll find out from you what your thoughts were in this scenario. So this is about an older man called Patrick. Patrick's got dementia. Patrick isn't communicating through words anymore. He's recently used his last words, so he doesn't speak. He's recently moved into a residential care setting. He's been married for many, many years, and he's not really ever been away from his wife before. This is the first time that they've really been separated for any lengthy period of time. Patrick is a vegetarian, and he's always been a strict vegetarian. It's been, and you know, he was a vegetarian before anybody else was a vegetarian. I mean, without trying to give away too much information, but you know, if there's like a vegetarian association, he set it up. You know, he met his wife through that. He's got 3 vegetarian children, a vegetarian dog and a vegan cat. I mean, it's a whole aspect of his lifestyle. And so in line with that, he moves into this residential care home, and he's been given, and he eats a roast beef dinner. So he eats this roast beef dinner. He enjoys it so much that he starts to seek out the food of other residents. His wife and sons are really upset about this, and they feel that Patrick's rights have been completely violated, and they say that they've got some safeguarding concerns about this. They think that if staff in the home allow Patrick to eat meat, there's safeguarding issues, but the staff feel that there are safeguarding issues if his wife and family stop him from making choices. So you've got the scenario here. I want to know what you would do, and I'm also curious as to why you would do that. So we don't want to lose it. The idea we had earlier, we were thinking the chat moves so quickly in the sessions sometimes. Sometimes it doesn't because everybody's really intently listening, but sometimes the chat's really busy. So we don't want to lose it in the chat. So if you've got thoughts about this is what I would do and this is why I would do it, just pop that into the Q&A section. We know it won't be a question, it will just be your thought, but then it means we can hold those there. And then after Yvonne's talked about professional curiosity and helped us to explore professional curiosity based on her many years of experience with this, Yvonne's going to help us to explore it. And after she's done that, we'll return to think about Patrick, and we'll find out from what you've written in the Q&A what you would do and why you would do it. So a bit of an introduction to professional curiosity there, and I'm going to hand over now to Yvonne, who's going to talk us through professional curiosity. So Yvonne, I'm going to hand straight over to you if that's okay.
Absolutely, that's fine. Thank you so much, Yvonne. Thank you so much for setting the scene. Really, really helpful. I think we'll just go straight into it, into the next slide, really. So we've already had the introduction around professional curiosity, and Siobhan is right. This term is really brand new in respect of the last couple of years. Some of people who read serious case reviews may learn that this term was coined within all of that because there were themes that were coming out in respect of the practice and what was coming out of practice. What were people needing to pay attention to? What was it in practice that we needed to revisit? And professional curiosity was one of the key aspects that came about, because what was evident is that there's certain questions maybe people were scared to ask. There's certain narratives and thought processes that people had. Maybe they were scared to think, is that possible? The last thing we want to think as human beings is that someone else could possibly undertake an action that could be so detrimental in respect of another human being's well-being. And what ends up happening is surprise. That which we thought was unthinkable is exactly what's happened. And because we haven't taken the time to reflect, we haven't taken the time to be curious enough to ask questions about a hypothesis that might be circulating around based on what we've seen, based on what we're smelling, based on what we've touched. You see, social work is not just about what we're thinking. We actually are using our senses as well. In the moment when we come across people, it's that smell. It's actually just the noises around. It's actually just what we're seeing. So when we look at professional curiosity, the working definitions that I utilize are pertinent to the capacity to really think about the communication skills that you're utilizing when interacting with another person, and actually trying to understand what is happening for them rather than assuming what might be happening for them. So we don't apply or impose what we might be thinking. It's letting them tell you their story. Professional curiosity, my favorite way of looking at it, is respectful noisiness, often called healthy skepticism. Rocking the boat. We're often in a society where we want to be prim and proper. Most of you can tell I'm not English, so prim and proper don't apply to me. So it's very difficult for me to appreciate not considering the alternative. So when you look at professional curiosity, it's about really thinking, well, let me ask this question. Let me see the response that I get. Let me go down a certain, road of questioning. Let me see the physical or the verbal or just the change that I may receive just because I've touched upon a subject that might be pertinent to this family or this individual or this circumstance. Next slide, please. Thank you. Key terms: safe uncertainty. We're often driven in social work to get to a place of being very sure about what it is that we're seeing. We actually have to be in a place where we can appreciate the fluidity and the variables that might affect a situation or a circumstance. So you need to take into consideration, for example, and I'll give an example in respect of working with children. The experiences that they might be in may not be sure concretion. Variables might be there. For example, if mom or dad has had a drink that night, that might change the elements of safety, that might change the scenario for that child. I do think it's important that we also maintain a level of being respectful with the uncertainty that we have. Yes, people will give you their narrative, but actually we need to critically evaluate as we interact, and within that, respectfully question. So you have said to me the following. I'm just trying to process that. Help me understand a bit more, because I would have thought 1, 2, or 3. This is, not really what I normally hear, but help me understand that a bit more. You have actually pursued a line of inquiry, but what you've done is being respectful and haven't got someone's back up against the wall. And I think that's where sometimes it can be difficult when it comes to practice. Relentless curiosity. This is always being in a place of anticipating that actually new concepts, new ideas may come about. You may be pursuing, you may be asking certain questions, a line of inquiry with a family or with an adult. However, what you need to be continuously thinking about is, this is probably not the final answer. There probably is something more to this. There might be more information that may affect the narrative that I'm being told at this moment in time. Practice wisdom. Something that I had to find really, really, really difficult to describe. I think it was very difficult for me to put what I was feeling into play. And then it popped in my head: practice wisdom. It's that which is inside of you, the intuition, the hairs on the back of your neck that stand up when you're in a certain environment, that actually in practice, you learn, when I am in this kind of a situation, if I was a child or if I was an adult in this kind of a circumstance, often what's happened or often what they may have experienced is the following. Practice wisdom is really the experience that you have, how it is that you fine-tune your experience into practicing in a way that allows you to have evidence. And sometimes the intuition that we have as social workers, it's very difficult to say in the courtroom, I feel, because I feel isn't allowed. It's actually about what is the evidence you rely upon to suggest that this may have happened to someone. So I do think that practice wisdom is that which is intangible, but it's the experience that comes with being a practitioner and how you combine that with what it is that you're feeling, but making it a practical step-by-step evidence-based approach. If I can go to the next slide, please. Placements and professional curiosity. I wish when I was a student, someone had mentioned professional curiosity during my placement time to really help me think about how I should approach my practice element. But that was different. It's not back in the day, Siobhan, no, it's not 32 years ago for me. But even back then, believe you me, professional curiosity was not something that, was easily taught in the placement. The placements are really supposed to be your tool, your ground to really explore and test out everything that you can possibly do safely within the confines, obviously, the support of your practice educator. But the placement is really the platform and arena where you can understand and practice professional curiosity even more so. So really, it enhances and utilizes your ability to understand yourself and what skill set you have. It really supports you in understanding what are your interests when it comes to practice. So you will see, if you pay attention, if you utilize, I'm going to say a keyword here, if you utilize your weekly logs and you take some time to think about what it is that you've done, you will often see sometimes where exactly your interests may lie and how it is you've approached certain casework that is undertaken within your placement environment. I do think that professional curiosity in your placements really helps you to understand how the PCF is actually quite key in the way in which you're going to be interacting with service users, members of the public. The placements expose you to different scenarios, different processes, different legislation. But within all of that, what you're still required to do is utilize your skill set, utilize your knowledge, utilize the tools around you in your placement to be able to practice in a safe, but also in an enlightening way. Skills utilizing professional curiosity. We've got a number of skills here. I could go on and on about each one, but key ones that I think are so important is, as Yvonne said earlier on, listening to understand. That is a key skill. Sometimes as social workers, it's very easy for us to be listening to then think about the next question I want to ask, because is it fitting into the assessment questions that I've got? I've got to complete this assessment within 35 days. So these are the things that I actually want to ask. It becomes process-led. So if you listen to understand, you'll find out keywords actually about the individual that you're working with. It leads me on to individual profiling. That is so key in professional curiosity. Who are you? What is it that gets you to pay attention to me? What language are you speaking? Because we all speak English, but each person we come across has a specific way in which they speak, a way in which they understand. We're often using sometimes professional speak. So we're using these big terminologies. And I've had service users who fed back key social work speak, social work language, if you want to put it that way. But actually, individual profiling and professional curiosity is important. I give the example of CSI or Law and Order, where they have the profile of the individual that it is that they want to find who's linked maybe to the crime. But what's helpful, what's important is they take the time to understand that person. They take the time to get to know what is it that links this individual to the issues or the circumstance. How is it that we are able to find this person? So do take the time to understand who you're working with. The last skill I'll highlight within all of this is thinking the unthinkable. Nothing is out of reach. Nothing is ever out of reach. Human beings, unfortunately, are capable of doing things that we wouldn't want them to be able to do. But the reality is we have to think the unthinkable. And if we can rule out that possibility, great. If the evidence that we then have before us that makes us deviate from that, great. But definitely think the unthinkable. If I can go to the next slide, please. A curiosity-driven culture. Pay attention to the placement environments you're in, to the organizations that you're working with, the local authorities that you're in, or even the independent work that you're doing. Are you in an environment that allows for you to be in a curiosity-driven culture? Which means, are you in a space where people are thinking beyond the realms of just the procedures? People are thinking beyond the realms of just, this is the day-to-day. Sometimes you often hear in social work, oh, it's the same old, same old. People are behaving the way in which they did 12 years ago. Actually, it's different. Our society has changed. No one can tell me that Instagram was a big hit 8 years ago. I don't remember what Instagram was 8 years ago. No, I'm not 95 or 100 years old. No disrespect to anybody, and I'm still pretty young, but at the end of the day, no one can tell me that Instagram hasn't changed our practice, hasn't changed the way in which our young people operate when they go off missing, or how actually it's utilized by people with a predatory nature. How is it that we're practicing now in this new culture? Are we focused on learning and teaching each other what are the ways in which social work practice needs to be developed to go along with the changes of our society? And without even, dismissing it, the pandemic has completely changed the way in which we do social work. Who would have thought that we would be practicing in a pandemic? Who would have thought that we would all have to stop at some point and then re-emerge? So what's important here is, are we in organizations that support the learning and being actually purposeful around the different ways in which curiosity is supported in practice? And this is from newly qualified all the way to people who are in senior management. No one, is beyond the ability to learn. No one is beyond the ability to be in a place where they can impart knowledge or receive knowledge. Next slide, please. At this point, just a proviso to everyone, I am going to briefly touch upon serious case reviews. As mentioned earlier on, they're part of the key tools actually that have highlighted the need for professional curiosity. The next slide will show you some images of children who you may be familiar with. So if this is sensitive for anyone who is watching, I do apologize, but I just want to bring it home so you understand actually the bigger picture of professional curiosity and sometimes the cost that comes with it when we haven't exercised it. If we can go to the next slide, please. So you can see all of these amazing, beautiful faces, beautiful children. Unfortunately, these children have all had horrific experiences, life-ending experiences. The primary example I will give is Daniel, who is in the red jumper that you can all see. And I'm sure most of you recognize Victoria and Baby P. But I focus on Daniel only to highlight this. When you read his serious case review, and they spoke about him having an eating disorder at such a young age, one has to inquire, what were the professional network around considering for this child? Is it a norm for a child his age to actually have an eating disorder? I think I read in the paperwork it referenced bulimia. So at this point, I'm going to just be a bit graphic here. If someone has got an eating disorder, such as bulimia, they will gorge in a large amount of food, and then they will physically intentionally make themselves unwell. So the question becomes, how at his age 3, 4, How is he able to undertake the process of gorging on a large amount of food and then intentionally making himself sick? How is it when you look at child development, how is it that a child his age would be in a place of understanding that process? Would one not be curious? Would one not want to actually find out and understand what is this actually possible? I do think when you read not only his serious case review, but the serious case reviews of a number of children, the one aspect that was highlighted was the network being professionally curious. So that's not only about social workers, it's actually about teachers, about police officers, the dinner lady, the safeguarding lead. Everybody has a responsibility to be professionally curious. Everyone wants to, maintain a relationship with a parent. Everyone wants to maintain a relationship, with an adult service user. But actually, if we're going to be safeguarding members of society appropriately, this means coming out of a comfort zone and being able to ask questions that should have been asked. And as stated earlier on in the definition, and not assuming that we know what is going on. And I reference the word assume again, because for Victoria Klimbe, there was an assumption that the person who was her primary caregiver at the time was her parent, but that person wasn't the parent. But the assumption was made based on the race, and the assumption was made based on language, just because they were speaking a similar language. Now I can gladly say, because of Victoria Klimbe, unfortunately, her passing led to hospitals now actually asking, are you the person with PR? Are you the individual with parental responsibility? So it's really, really helped. It's really supported us moving on in the culture of just accepting what we see at face value and actually outright asking the right questions. As stated already here, what have we learned from serious case reviews? For Victoria Klimbe, suggested that social workers needed to practice critical evaluation of information they receive and maintain an approach which is focused for safety of the children and taking into account changing information, different perspectives. And this is what's key about professional curiosity. The information will change. It's not always going to be the same because people are not always the same. Today you're happy, tomorrow it might be a bit of a different story. The day after it might be different again. And again for Peter Connolly, again for Peter Connolly and Daniel Palka, was emphasizing the need for professionals to develop relationships with families that lead us to understanding their experience. So if you understand someone else's experience, allow them to tell their story, allow them to be in a position whereby they give you their narrative. That helps you to build a relationship. And that in that relationship, you've then got a platform to be able to ask as many questions as possible, because people let their guard down once they have a dynamic of being able to interact with you without seeing your job title, social worker. Ooh. So it's really important to build relationships with families. Barriers to professional curiosity. For those of you who've already got jobs before you qualified, for those of you who are, looking to have a primary frontline social work job in the next few years, you will often hear people talk about time. People talk about engagement and disguised compliance, skills and self-awareness. All of these, they definitely are barriers to professional curiosity. However, I would suggest one looks at the intentionality of your practice. Utilize supervision sessions, utilize your colleagues around you, utilize your learning year, because everyone will go through an ASYE year. And in that year, it's your opportunity to home in on how do I manage time as much as possible in order for me to embed professional curiosity naturally as I practice, as I go forward. I do think that it's also important for you to have a high level of self-awareness, because you are bringing yourself to practice. As much as we bring the professional self, there is also the you self, the human being that comes with that. And you have to have an awareness of, okay, what is my personal view and what is my professional view? And so it's important for you to have a self-awareness and an awareness of your own skills. What do I need to be upskilled in? What exactly are my learning needs? Curiosity tools. geneograms, chronologies, supervision, as already stated, a systemic approach, which is relationship-based, because this is really more so what you will find in practice now, relationship-based ways of interacting with people. It's very key. I definitely think direct work, whether it's with adults, whether it's with children, that's important. These are curiosity tools. With geneograms, you get to find out who's who, who's close, who's not close. The next slide, please. Again, I've already spoken to you about the relationship model and professional curiosity. Definitely, please do look up the relationship model, because that's really, really key. That really moves away from having just a one-sided outlook. It's really quite holistic. It really considers different factors within which people can be appreciated in terms of their life experience. I do again emphasize the supervision element, because that's where you can tap into the skill set of your superiors, or tap into the skill set of those who are supporting you with your work. That's going to be key. Direct work, again, that's also key. And professional geneograms is also key. Who else within the network for this person that I'm working with is close enough to that individual to make an impact? Sometimes it's actually the nurse that comes to see them every so often. That's the person who they actually pay attention to and listen to. So it's about utilizing the professional networks as well, and seeing how we can support people with individuals who are close enough to be able to influence them. Next slide, please. So be honest with yourself. Take some time. What am I learning from serious case reviews? What is it about my practice I can honestly state needs to change? No one's practice is perfect. We are constantly evolving in practice. We're constantly learning in practice. What are longstanding issues that require reframing? And again, that's very much systemic practice. But I think it's important to always go back to the drawing board and always reevaluate where you are and what learning journey that you're on. Because like I said, no one knows everything. We're all constantly in a place of learning. I think I've got one more slide, Siobhan. Additional questions. These are some questions that you can take away with you, I think, when the session is on YouTube. These are things to think about when you're doing your reflective logs as students, actually. You know, have I utilized any of these aspects in my placement experience? Because if you start utilizing them now in your placement, when you are qualified practitioners, it's just going to be something that comes naturally to you. And it will definitely, definitely help you in respect of your practice moving forward. I think my time might just be up.
Thank you, Yvonne. Thank you for that. And you're spot on time as well. So that's brilliant. Thank you very much for that. And I think that's really helped us to see, I suppose, dig that bit deeper into what do we mean by professional curiosity. So thank you very much for that. It was really helpful. It really made me think. I was writing a few notes down and thinking, oh, that's really helpful for me. So I think wherever we are on our social work journey, it's always worth to relook at this. And I think demonstrating the skills, and what you really showed there was the connectivity of it all. So that was great. Thank you very much, Yvonne. We've got still quite a lot to get through, so I'm going to go back now to what we've been talking about. And just, I suppose, for me, the connectivity. We've talked a bit before about head, heart, hands. And for me, when I saw Yvonne's slides, when she sent them through to us, it made me think about how this is about our whole self. You know, Yvonne's just said it's about our whole self. And so maybe we could think about our head, our heart, and our hands. How do we demonstrate professional curiosity through your head, your heart, and your hands? And I've just put that up on the screen there, just I suppose to add into this bit about bringing your whole self. So now I'm going to ask you, we're going to go back to Patrick, and I've been looking at the responses that you've put in the Q&A whilst Yvonne was talking. I had a quick sneaky look in there. Now, Chris, I don't know. Can you tell me, Chris, is everybody able to see all of the Q&A? So can everybody see everybody else's comments, or do they not get to see that?
No, they should be able to see them. If they open up the Q&A box, they're all there. Okay. So if people would like to do that.
Okay, fabulous. So people can tell us, people have been telling us about doing capacity assessments. People have talked about different aspects of mental health legislation, I think I might have seen, or certainly some Care Act legislation, lots of capacity, loads and loads of capacity stuff. There's a few about, you know, I'll read a couple out that I think would be interesting, and especially because they're anonymous, so it means I'm not picking on anybody, okay? So I can see one said, I'd find out his wishes and feelings, exploring different communication methods until I find out one that works or I've explored them all. I want to know what he wants and why. I think that's really helpful. It's really helpful to think, actually, what does Patrick want? And maybe why does he want it? But what does Patrick want is the central bit, isn't it, really? And a lot of people have sort of talked about, is it, you know, why is he a vegetarian? Does it make it any different if it's because of a faith or a belief? Is it, or if a values and ethics thing, or is it just he doesn't like the taste of meat? Does it make a difference? And some people have asked that question, haven't they? But I'm going to pick out one particular one here, and I hope that people don't mind, and it is anonymous, so I'm not kind of putting anybody on the spot. And the person may have put this in just to put the point. So the anonymous attendee has said, why are the family upset if Patrick has clearly enjoyed the meal and wants more? It was an honest mistake made, which led to an unexpected outcome, which apparently makes someone happy. And then it goes on to say, as long as he understands he's eating meat and he can communicate his thoughts. What I'm really interested in is, how do you know it was an honest mistake? How do you know that Patrick clearly enjoyed the meal and wants more? I'm going to go back to something that was in the chat earlier on that Yvonne said, and I value everything that you've put into the Q&A, but what I'd say is, just stand back a minute. Just stand back and look at that screen again. It's exactly the same as it was earlier. I should have changed the man in a later point to Patrick. Previously, I'd always said the man, and tonight I thought I'll use a name, and then I've obviously not changed it completely. But just look at that slide again. How have you decided that Patrick enjoys eating meat? How have you decided that it was an honest mistake? Because in the chat earlier, Angie asked, why do we accept information at face value? So why have you all accepted that information that I've given you at face value? Ask yourself that. Is it because, I don't know, maybe I'm being a bit big-headed here, but is it because you trust me? You think that what I've written on a slide is true? But how do we know that it was a mistake that he was given a roast dinner? And how do we know that he's enjoying it so much he's seeking out the food of residents? Isn't that just what Warren said in the chat earlier? Different people have different perspectives on the same situation. There's no singular truth. So whose view is that he's enjoyed this and he's seeking out the food of other residents? And how do you know all of that? And I talked about listening to understand, and Yvonne talked about listening to understand. So now I'm going to ask you, how do you listen to understand? How do you listen to understand, especially when somebody isn't verbally communicating? What's the listening like then? For me, you listen with your whole body. You don't just listen with your ears, you listen with your eyes. And so in this situation here, what I thought was, and I'm cutting this very, very short, there's a much longer story to get into this point, but my perspective was, I was thinking, obviously he doesn't like the vegetarian meals at the home. This is the first thing that came into my head. I'm taking you through my thought process. I thought it's probably really not a very good vegetarian menu, because this is quite a long time ago when, you know, probably the only vegetarian option was cauliflower cheese or a cheese omelette or something, you know, and I was thinking he's probably bored of the veggie stuff, and I bet the veggie food isn't great. But I thought, if I say to the residential home, can you tell me what's the vegetarian menu, they'll probably give me, like, you know, it'll look fabulous, but actually it's probably doesn't taste great. So I thought the best thing I can do is just go and have a look at the food, really. So that was my hypothesis. My hypothesis was completely wrong, but the going and having a look at the food is what worked, because I was curious, and I thought, I know that, you know, I'm going to get told it's the best food ever, and we've got this award-winning chef and all. If you know, so the only really way is for me to go and see with my own eyes. So I turned up one lunchtime. I'd phoned up and I'd asked if I could come in at lunchtime and sort of sit with Patrick at lunchtime. But when I arrived, the care home had bought loads of, all the family were there. The family had bought a solicitor. I mean, it was really hotting up. It got really, so I kind of dealt with that. That's another story. But then I did go back and sit at the lunchtime and just sit and thought, you know, I'll just sit here and enjoy a meal with Patrick or whatever. So I'll just sit. And I sat, and it was a really big old residential service. I don't know, like massive round tables that people came and sat. And it was very posh. It had, you know, big like chandeliers in the room. It was like a really fancy room. And so the doors opened. I was sat in there already, and Patrick walked in and he went and sat down somewhere. And other people were coming in, and it took quite a long time for this like dining room to fill up, you know, and other people were coming in. And in the meantime, Patrick got up and he moved several times and sat in lots of different places. And I think, you know, he was probably getting a bit bored actually, because it took quite a long time for people to get in. And then this big hatch opened up at the other end, and then somebody shouts from behind the food, and I'm just waiting for the food to come out, but someone shouts, like the woman that's serving or whatever shouts, the purees first. So all the staff go up and got some kind of food and brought it back to people who had a particular need for a particular kind of diet. And then they shouted gluten-free next. And then they went up and they bought something out, they bought something out, and then they bought this out, and then they bought that out. Patrick had been sat there half an hour before any food came out. And my view is he just got bored. He just got bored because he thought, I'm sat here waiting for my dinner, and he just took the food from the person next to him and ate it. And then he left before the vegetarian food had even come out. So the answer to that was just bring his dinner out first. And it completely changed everything. To me, there was no him actually actively seeking to eat meat. I don't even know whether there was a mistake in the first place or whether that had happened every mealtime. But the thing about this is, the word professional curiosity makes it seem like, oh, it's all professionalized. So let's go. And I've had people saying to me, I'm going to make laminated cards with all the food on. I'm going to take them in. I'm going to show them a laminated card that's a piece of meat with a cow next to it. So I'm going to do this. And it's fabulous ideas, great ideas, but just simplify it. Just cut all of the complexity out to start with. And sometimes we overcomplicate situations. And the first thing to do is just use your whole self. Listen. Actively listen to what's going on. And listening isn't about conversations. And I think sometimes people just think listening is just about talking and answers, and it's not. Listening is about exactly what Yvonne said. Listening, really listening to understand, is about listening to the environment, listening to what's going on, you know, smelling the food, seeing the food. That is all listening. So use all of that sensory experience. Now, it was a really straightforward scenario. It worked out very straightforward in the end. It might not have done, but what I'm trying to suggest to you is be curious. You all took that too much on face value without actually saying, well, how do we know this? None of you said, I don't think I saw that at all. How do you know this? How have you got this information? So where did I get this information from? I've told you a story. And you've just bought straight into the story. Professional curiosity is, how do you know that? Who told you that? Where's that information come from? That is professional curiosity. So thank you for having a go with that. Just recognize that, you know, we do actually all see things differently, don't we? There you are. Two perspectives on the same scenario. There is no singular truth. The way you see something is not the way that somebody else understands it or sees it. And it doesn't mean that they're lying. It just means that they see it differently. So one hint is avoid the word obviously when you're talking about your work in supervision. So many people say that to me, obviously. And I'm thinking, well, it's obvious to you. It's not obvious to me because I see it differently. So just try and avoid words like obviously. Think about, recognize how you see something is not how somebody else sees something. I think sometimes now I see social workers just being too concrete about everything, and that person said this, so they're lying. Actually, they see it like that, you know. So let's explore this a little bit more. Just be more conscious of how you see things. And so on that note, how do you see this? There's something in front of you now. I'm going to ask you what you see, and Jenna and Kai are going to tell me, and I want you to put in the chat what you see. So how curious are you? Jenna, tell me what you see. Tell me maybe what you saw at first. You might see something different now, but when we first decided we were going to do this, tell me what you see.
Colourful jigsaw, very pretty.
Yeah, you said I don't want to say that, it's too obvious, it's stating the obvious. You said that, didn't you? You said I don't want to say
I did.
Okay, so that's what you see. What about you, Kai? Put your mic on and tell us. Your mic wasn't working earlier, but hopefully it is.
Yeah, it should be working now, hopefully. I can see sort of words that aren't really there, but for some reason the one that's standing out to me is yolks, like an egg yolk. But yeah, other than that, lots of colours. A bit too many colours actually for me. It's sort of confusing my brain.
Interesting, Kai, because I've shown this to people for years, and I think you're the first person who's ever said to me, I see the word yolks, and I'm like, why? Is that because we were talking about eggs earlier and chickens? I'm like, is that why Kai saw yolks? You know, that's really interesting. Okay, what are people saying in the chat? What do you see? And it can be obvious. It can be say what you see, like that television program catchphrase. It might be a word, but it might be something else. So say what you see. What do you see? Tell me what you see. Tell me in the chat what you see.
Angie Beaumont, she's seen a systems theory in a puzzle, like a genogram or eco map in a more creative way.
Oh, there you go. Thank you for that, Angie. Lovely. Anybody seeing anything else?
I see Dave said that he just sees the one blank space, I think, where the reflection from the camera or the light or whatever has blanked out that space.
Absolutely. But Kai, that's interesting, because you've just said it's the reflection from the camera has blanked out the space. Other people see an empty space. Other people see a missing piece. So again, you've seen it as it's flashing, but some people see it as a missing piece. Anything else that people can see there? There's loads of words you could make. Is there some new word game that I've seen the team are starting to get into as well, called Wordle or something? I don't know if this looks anything like Wordle, but I'm like, come on, guys, you're all playing that Wordle game. You must be able to see words in here. What words can you see? What words can you see? Tell me your words. Are we getting any other words? Have we only got yolks? Is that all?
There's a lot of focus on that missing piece. Somebody thinks it's a black piece, missing piece. Tanya Nunn likes the shiny piece, one shiny piece. Jessica Lavray, the shiny piece in the middle, the letter Y standing out for Pauline Anderson.
Okay, so there's different letters standing out for people then. There's this missing piece. Okay, let's just say what we see. Jenna saw a jigsaw. The reason that I've done this is because very often, like when we're talking about things like serious case reviews, we say, well, we had all the pieces of information, we just didn't put them together in the puzzle. We didn't complete the puzzle of information or something like that. We often talk about, you know, gathering information as like being a jigsaw and getting all the pieces of the puzzle. Okay, but when you do a jigsaw, they give you a picture to follow and you just can finish in that piece that, you know, you've got a picture to follow. Social work, you don't get a picture to follow. You're gathering the pieces of information for your jigsaw, but nobody's giving you a picture that you're finishing off. You're making it look like that picture. So in this, we've got all the bits of the information, but it makes no sense, does it? You're looking at it, Kai's saying it's almost too much. It makes no sense because it's too much, because you've got some stripes, some spots, some flowers, different colors, you've got different, you know, styles and everything. But in there, you can use every single letter to create something. But it depends where you are. I tell you one, I mean, honestly, nobody's ever said to me before, Kai, that they see the word yolk, and sometimes I stay on it forever and no one's ever seen the word yolk. So it shows you the words that we make and then think, why do we make that word? When I do this with social workers who are in Wales, they nearly always see the word Wales. I don't know if any of you saw the word Wales, but the word Wales is in there. Risk is in there. Look for the risk. Risk is there. There's loads of different words in there that you could make up. But actually, to use every single letter, it's about social work, synthesizing information and analyzing information. And that's really what professional curiosity is. It's about gathering this information. But what do we do with all of these different pieces? They might not fit together and they might fit together in different ways. And when I looked at this afterwards, I've realized even on the analysis, I put the S upside down there, look, because I thought, oh, it fits better that way. But actually it doesn't look right, does it? Because the S is upside down. But all of this stuff, as a social worker, it's like puzzles. You're going to have all of the pieces of the puzzle. Don't, you know, serious case reviews, looking back in hindsight, people will say, well, we had all the pieces of the puzzle. You've got all the pieces. What are you going to do with them? They don't always fit neatly together into a square. Sometimes you've got to do this with them. They've got to be creative. But that is what was in that puzzle. That is the social work synthesis, couldn't say it then, synthesis and analysis of information. So I'm hoping that this evening we've maybe got you to think a little bit about your curiosity. Maybe just think about curiosity. What are your skills in curiosity? If you can change the way that you see things, the things that you see will change. People see things in so many different ways. Nothing is clear cut, nothing is concrete. But I started off really this evening by saying to you, this is about going beyond storytelling. But for the first time ever, we've never ever done this before, but we like to try out different things in our webinars over time. And tonight we're going to end with a story. If you're as old as me, you'll remember Jackanory. I felt like we should have like the Jackanory theme tune playing at this point, because I'm going to do you a story. I think nowadays it's the CBeebies bedtime story that's very popular. I've heard on the news that people read the CBeebies bedtime story. So imagine I'm reading you a bedtime story now. I'm going to read you a story. This story is all about professional curiosity. It's not called professional curiosity. It's a fabulous story. Beautifully written from the team behind Social Work, Cats and Rocket Science. And if you work in adults and you haven't got that book, you need to get that book. It's great. So it's written by that team. I've got their permission to read this story out tonight because there's a story behind the story. If you've been to lots of our webinars, you'll know that I've talked to you before about having a stroke. So it'll be 9 years ago this year that I had a stroke. I was in hospital for quite a long time. I lost the ability to read and write when I had the stroke, and I had to relearn to read. And I've relearned to read in a very different way. My reading skills are very different now than they were. I read words as if they were pictures. I can't phonetically sound them out. It's really hard to explain, but I read in a different way now than I ever did before. And I never, as part of my recovery from my stroke, I wouldn't read anything out in front of anybody. I wouldn't read out loud. I didn't like reading something. If somebody gave me something, I didn't read something, didn't like it. And then I read this story. And I loved this story so much that I wanted to read it out to people. And I practiced it. I remember practicing reading out loud to my family. All my family know this story. And then I read this story during a training session. And I love this story. It has personal meaning for me because it really helped me to redevelop my reading skills and build my confidence. But for me, this is a story of professional curiosity. So we're going to have a bedtime story now. So if you're all sitting comfortably, this is the story. It's called Someone to Safeguard. The referral was pretty bog standard these days. The neighbours didn't get Elsie's permission for any of her details to be referred to social services. In truth, it had never crossed their minds they'd be asked for it. When pushed by the call centre about the issue of consent, they said they didn't think they needed her consent because this was a matter that the council must take seriously for everyone's sake. And then, behind the thinly veiled threat to act, the neighbour stumbled upon 4 little words, magic words, words that suddenly change the meaning of everything, and words that seemingly come with their own legislation, procedures, judges and juries. It's a safeguarding issue. And boom, there it is. Elsie, aged 87, never known to the council, never having failed to pay for council services or any other tax that propped up a welfare state that she didn't really partake in, was known. Consent overridden, case opened. Within moments, Elsie had an electronic file. Elsie had a reference number, and Elsie would receive an automated letter thanking her for contacting the council. All done within 5 short minutes from the start of the phone conversation. Within 10 minutes, Elsie was on a waiting list of other reference numbers waiting to be allocated to a social worker and sitting on a computer screen of a manager. Whether Elsie used services or not, from that moment on to the day of her death, nothing was clearer. Elsie was a service user, and there was a record to prove it. There was, as far as everyone was concerned, someone to safeguard. The social workers went in twos to the address. No one was quite sure why. The referral said that Elsie had got cats, but there wasn't a belief the cats were dangerous. Perhaps the second social worker was there because social workers love cats. The referral said the house was dirty. There were things everywhere. It was cluttered. There were soiled pads in the garden. And Elsie, although not seen for some weeks, was wholeheartedly felt by the neighbours to be dirty. She's self-neglecting. Having knocked at the door and getting no response, the social workers pushed slightly at it and the door opened. A cat ran out and then back in again. There was no sign of Elsie in the hallway. The social workers called her name, walking gingerly through the hallway, past a sideboard with some framed pictures of a mustachioed man with Geraldo, King of Swing, emblazoned on them. Calling out her name and holding out their ID badges, the social workers continued inwards. Elsie was in the kitchen. She smiled when she saw the social workers and she beckoned them in still further. The social workers introduced themselves. Whilst doing so, Elsie kept smiling before she raised her hand as if to stop the second social worker saying their name. And then Elsie bent forward and she placed her right ear up against what looked like a radiogram from footage used to show listening to the broadcasts of Prime Minister Churchill telling them they wouldn't surrender. Almost trance-like, Elsie's smile remained fixed as she listened to the radio. Elsie probably listened to the radio for a full 3 minutes. To the social workers who were observing the cats and the newspapers, and one from May 1991 with a picture of Paul Gascoigne on, they were moving their feet on the sticky floor. The 3 minutes felt like a lifetime. When Elsie moved away from the radio, she asked the social workers, "Who are you again, love?" Social workers explained who they were and said they were there to see if she was all right, to see how things are. Elsie said she was fine. She asked if the neighbour had asked for them to visit. "She's lovely like that, she really looks out for me." Elsie explained that she'd lived in the house all of her life. Her parents, who she said had died recently in 1971 and 1975, had left the house to her. The social workers listened. They wanted to be respectful. They had questions, of course, and they had lots of boxes to tick, but they'd already decided that things weren't right. They still listened. Halfway through talking, Elsie's eyes suddenly lit up. "John," she said. Within moments, Elsie was back to the other side of the kitchen, head propped up against the radio, the same expression on her face, which now to the social workers seemed almost rapturous. This time, a longer wait. 5 minutes. Elsie broke her concentration just the once to beckon the social workers to sit down. Neither of them did. Elsie didn't notice or care. Elsie said that John worked for the radio. He was in his late 40s and his job was a broadcaster. Every day, John either announced the news or he introduced big bands. Sometimes he did both. Elsie said that John was based in London. He still lived there. Sometimes John slept at the radio station and then he broadcast during the night, but not usually. The social workers continued to listen, but really they wanted to talk about the cats and Elsie's daily routine and keeping clean, more in an effort to wrap the conversation up about John and to move on to the matters at hand, the self-neglect. One of the social workers asked a question. "John sounds lovely. Is he someone you've actually met and know?" And with that, the tone of the conversation changed. Elsie said that John had spoken to her on the radio for more than 60 years. He was her man friend. He was engaged to marry her, her betrothed. John had promised Elsie that one day he was going to drive up from London in a big white Bentley car and marry her. Their plan was to live in London. John was going to take Elsie away from all of this. On walking to the door with the social workers, Elsie thanked them for coming, but said they had to go now because John liked to talk to her alone. Elsie smiled as she shut the door behind them. The last thing the social workers heard Elsie say as the door closed was that John was her man. He wasn't for sharing. Goodbye. The social workers weren't inexperienced. One of them had just become an approved mental health professional, and the other one had worked with older people for years. But as they walked back to their cars and they drove back to the office, the silence between them spoke more than any words of the completed boxes on the safeguarding form. What on earth was all that about? Safeguarding referrals can be complex. The social workers knew that. They also knew that to help Elsie, they needed to get to know her. They needed to build up trust. So the visits continued through the next week. On each occasion, Elsie spoke to the social workers, but she continued to ignore any of their questions about her health, her well-being, her cats, and the state of the house. Most questions were met with, "I know, love, John will see to it, don't be worrying." All of the conversations were interspersed with long periods of Elsie listening to the radio and smiling with occasional knowing nods and some ahs aimed at the social workers, as if John was further confirming plans that need to be relayed back to the social workers. For the most part, the social workers just heard the hiss of an untuned radio. For them, there was no voice, there was no programme, and without doubt, there was no John. But what bothered the social workers more than this was that there was no progress. There was no getting Elsie to see what kind of state she was in. There was no getting Elsie to consent to sorting out the house. No getting Elsie to realise the safeguarding issue, the self-neglect, the abuse. Safeguarding doesn't allow for stalemate or for someone to continue to be abused. It identifies abuse, and through a list of outcomes, it makes the social workers do something. For the social workers, things just needed fixing. Elsie had a choice. Either she worked with them to improve the situation, or they would refer to other agencies. The case notes were clear. Elsie wouldn't engage. She lacked capacity to make the decision. It was all in her best interests. The risks were unmanageable. The hoarding was a fire risk. The cats were underfed, and the RSPCA were really cross. Elsie needed safeguarding. If only she could see it. She was a problem. The problem needed fixing. The social workers didn't seek Elsie's consent to refer to other agencies. In Elsie's case, the other agencies was the mental health team. Elsie was visited by a community psychiatric nurse who within hours visited again, this time with a psychiatrist. The social workers received a call. "How have you let this go on for so long? She's in a terrible way. She's totally delusional with paranoid ideation, and she's refusing all treatment because of this bloody John thing." The next call was to the AMP. Pink papers in the bag. The Mental Health Act assessment was to take place that evening. The ambulance couldn't stay. Eventually, the police were called. 87-year-old Elsie was escorted out of the property by 2 young police officers. One of the police officers had to switch the radio off during the incident in the house. He at least had the foresight to give the radio to Elsie, and he told her that she could hold on to it in the back of the car. It was the only bit of humanity that Elsie ever witnessed, either that evening or throughout her entire dealings with the support agencies. Section 2 completed, safeguarding outcome achieved. No more self-neglect. Elsie had been safeguarded. The first thing Elsie did on the ward was find a plug for the radio. John was there, reassuring her, helping her to stop crying. And that's how things stayed for a number of weeks. The medication was taken. Elsie complied. The nurses moved on to the next person. Elsie listened to John. There was no more worry about Elsie from the neighbours. The problem had been fixed. There was no more self-neglect. There was no more self-to-neglect. Elsie's care plan said needs all cares, and that's what she had. All cares attended to, and a continued love affair with John. The discharge planning meeting never once considered home. Home was where the multidisciplinary team felt the bad thing had happened. Home was where the cats had had to be removed and where the social workers had found Elsie's love letters to John. They'd ensured merriment on the ward because of the details she went into about her feelings for him. The self-neglect would just restart at home, and why risk it all? Elsie was happy enough, everything was fixed. Apart from the John thing. The care home never fully read the care plan about Elsie, and the new social worker had never really written much up about John and what happened at home. The radio didn't go with Elsie to the care home. Elsie noticed this as soon as she got there. Instead of asking for the radio, Elsie screamed for 8 hours. In the end, she was given medication. The care home didn't call the hospital or speak to the psychiatrist about how distressed Elsie was. They made just one phone call that day to the social worker requesting more funding because of the screaming, the impact it was having on other patients and staff. Over the next 3 months, Elsie moved into 2 different care homes and she was returned to hospital following a fall. The radio never was switched back on. Elsie died in a care home. It was 4 months, 5 days, and 6 hours after the phone call from the neighbour. Lord Justice Mumby said, "What's the point in making someone safe if we merely make them miserable?" In ensuring that Elsie was miserable, we were even unfit to ensure that she was safe. John did exist for Elsie, and we never saw that. John was the risk management plan. John stopped Elsie self-neglecting, not the other way around. Elsie was the expert in her own situation, and she had an 87-year start on the rest of us who tried to study her and fix her within a couple of weeks. John was Elsie's flickering light of hope. We extinguished it in the name of safeguarding people from themselves. I hope that Elsie saw John again somehow. And that story is so beautifully crafted, but it demonstrates how this matters. This is people's lives. Over-professionalising something overcomplicates it. This is just about curiosity and relationships. So thank you for joining us tonight. Thank you very much to Yvonne for bringing the expertise about professional curiosity to share with us. Next week, our session is led by a guest. It's an entirely guest-led webinar promoting non-violence in social work conversations. And then we're back to a team-led webinar on keeping reflective journals. I just wanted to say to you and point out at this point, Wednesday, the 9th of March, it's a way away, I know, but we've got Sarah Jane coming to share with us a session called Between the Lines and Asking the Whys. Trauma, a lived experience. That will only be available for live attendance. We will not be videoing that. So if you want to come, you really need to make sure that you're able to attend live. And that will actually dig deeper into asking the whys, professional curiosity from a lived perspective. Thank you ever so much to everybody, and good night.